Time to check in with our CJAD 800 legal contributor, that is Chris Dimakos. So Chris, it's interesting, we were talking about this just the other day from a different perspective, tenants, landlords, that time of the year, and you bring up something that we actually saw in the inflation numbers, and that's the fact that rent continues to be a big driver of inflation, which means you can expect to get a rent increase. They are, in fact, the main drivers of inflation. So let's get to a couple of these situations. Let's start off with a tenant. How much, or what is the limit, if there is one, to what a landlord can request as a rent increase, given that their costs have gone up?
Right, and this is a common misconception. The Rental Board Tribunal, they come out with numbers every year, giving you an approximate amount of what's considered reasonable given the costs of energy and heating and oil and all that kind of stuff. And they put together some guidelines, not that you're bound by them, but they give you an idea of what would be acceptable. And usually, if you look back at the last 10, 15 years, they've always hovered around 1.5%, 2% sometimes. Well, they just came out with their guidelines for this. I think it was yesterday afternoon, and they're at 4%. So if somebody has a rent of about $2,000, well, you're looking at $80 to $100 a month increase, and they've said that that's what should be considered very acceptable during these times. So the amounts of rents that are increasing are doing so at a much higher pace, and that's all because of inflation. We've seen that, and landlords are dealing with increased interest rates. They're dealing with increase on their renovations. Everything costs more, not to mention the fact that I just read an article from one of the financial institutions that says that because of our record level of immigration levels, that's also taking a hit on our occupancy. And so people are renting it out to the highest bidder, and that's also driving costs up. But to answer your question, no, there's no limit to what a landlord can ask for. Now, if you think it's unreasonable, it doesn't mean you have to accept it. But if you get something around that 3 or 4% increase per month, and you don't want to agree to it, you're going to have a hard time defending that if you decide to go to the rental board and say, hey, that's unreasonable to raise 4%, because they just issued out their guidelines, which is at 4%.
But Chris, is it on a case-by-case basis, though? Not every landlord is going to be facing the same situation.
Absolutely, case-by-case basis. Absolutely right, Aaron. And it doesn't mean that because, what they said 4%, a landlord can't ask for 10%. And
I didn't know that.
Yeah, there's absolutely no prohibition. There's no limit as to what you can raise, but the tenant has to agree to it. And if you don't agree to it, well, then you go in front of the rental board, and they both parties try and justify who's right and what is reasonable, and they come to a decision.
I mean, you hear the surprise in my voice. I honestly thought that you're calling them guidelines. I thought that was the rule. I thought the rule was we set this limit. You can't ask for more than that amount. Common
misconception. And one thing that landlords are dealing with is, the value of their building that they're renting out is highly based on the rent that it earns. So when you have a building and you want to sell it or you want to leverage it to use as collateral, well, what they do to evaluate the value of that building, yes, the age and what state of repair is in is a factor, but most of all, it's the rent. How much rent is this building? If it's a revenue property, how much rent does it generate? So landlords sometimes feel like they have to raise the rent, not just to pay for the cost, but also because they want their building to be worth a little bit more if they plan to sell it or to leverage it to buy another asset.
An interesting story as we talk about this sort of as an aside, given all these increases that landlords are now dealing with, saw an interesting study the other day suggesting that at least here, and I imagine it's the same in a lot of places, people who buy condos, you talk about revenue properties, and then want to rent them, that's not even a winning proposition anymore. With interest rates going up, maintenance costs going up, fees in these buildings going up, there's probably going to be, I would guess, fewer and fewer rental properties to begin with because it doesn't make sense to own and then find yourself a tenant.
Right, and you just hit it on the nail on the head. What they're coming out with now, all these post-COVID reports, and they've all said the same thing, that what we dealt with was not a consumer irrational. It wasn't like consumers were irrational. It was a supply issue, and that's what drove inflation, a lack of supply. And what you just said is absolutely true. Many people who had these condos that they're renting out have sold them because they couldn't afford. They were losing money every month. So there's less supply going around. I've heard stories about the federal government trying to increase supply, which would drive rents down a bit, but it's a supply issue. You're absolutely right. And until that gets rectified, And if we still have record numbers of for the population increasing in Canada, that's a recipe for disaster. So there's no question that rents are going to remain high for some time. That's for sure.
Can you walk us through the process? I mean, I'm still trying to process this information that those guidelines aren't firm, that there's flexibility in there. But let's say, the landlord sends out the notice to the tenant, and you don't like the increase, or you do like the increase. What are the procedures? What do you do from there?
Here's the process. Landlord wants to raise rent. So let's say we take a July 1st lease that renews every July 1st. They have to send out a notice between January 1st and March 31st. They send a notice out to the tenant basically saying, hey, we want to increase your rent by this percent or by this amount of money. There's a notice actually that you use off the rental board's website. They send that to the tenant. Now, the tenant has 30 days to reply and say, I agree to the increase, I disagree to the increase. But if they just ignore it, it's presumed to be accepted. So be careful with that. If you get these notices, keep an eye on the date as to when you get it, because you have 30 days to respond to that. And if a tenant says, I don't agree, well, then the next step would be for the landlord to file at the rental board to basically assess whether or not their increase is valid and reasonable, and the tribunal is going to decide. Now, if you want my advice, it's always best to pick up the phone if you are either a landlord or a tenant and say, let's talk about this. Hear me out on my side, hear me out. And usually it always gets resolved when both parties hear each other's situation out. If you're a good tenant, obviously the landlord doesn't want to lose you, and vice versa. If you have a good landlord and you like where you live, you don't want to have issues with that. So it's always best to just talk it out before just answering something without knowing exactly what the thing is. And many people are worried that the landlord's going to kick them out. You cannot get kicked out of your place just because you refused a rental increase. You have the right to remain in your apartment. Now, that increase might go through, might be approved later on if they're at the tribunal, but you don't lose your apartment if you disagree with a rental increase.
I want to go back to something you just said in the wake of something, again, we had just talked about, which was someone having their apartment repossessed, or
right.
I guess that was the case. And that is the fact that when she received the notice, in that particular case, you don't even have to respond. But in the case you're suggesting, when it's an increase, you better respond or you're judged to have accepted?
Absolutely, yeah. So it's a little bit different. You're right. There's no presumption when you're talking about other types of notices. But in terms of the rental increase, if you ignore it and it gets lost in the mail and you go about your daily business and forget about it, it's presumed to have accepted it. So you want to get on that sooner than later. And like I said, if you're not sure, if you think it's a lot, you heard the guidelines at 4%, but if you think your landlord is asking for too much based on what took place, nothing bars you from having a conversation with the landlord. And I've seen tenants and landlords come to agreements that are not even as simple as just yes or no. Sometimes they say, you know what, I'll give you this and this in return. I'll add this to your current lease, use of a locker or a garage for the increase I'm asking for. There's different things you can negotiate. So it's not just a question of do I accept or not accept. If you pick up the phone and have a conversation, most likely you'll come to a resolution.
Okay, good advice as always. Chris, thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.